Okay. Right. Okay, so we were up to the top of Yutes Amud Aleph. We're going to try and move relatively quickly through the next daf, couple of dafim, to get to the other main some other sugas that are coming up. So let's we talked about this was the second line on Yutes Amud Aleph. Yeah, Brechas HaKosim was the washing. The pool that's used for washing. You can't put those things, clothes, whatever. You can't put those near to the wall. Unless you distance it 3 tefachim. V'sod b'sid. Now the question, he says, this is actually this is actually 3 tefachim from the machamson. The machamson is the pool that you soak the garments in for a day or two. They used to soak them in dog excrement. Until they basically that removed anything, I suppose. Then they had to get rid of it. They did. And then the problem was that of course they had to get rid of that smell. There was nothing left after that in terms of whatever was there before. But the problem was they had to get rid of that, and that was the menagion. The menagion is basically where I think they used to sort of scrub it and after the soaking, yeah, and presumably to actually with water and everything else. That needs 4 amos, daladamas. Imagine daladamas because of the water, I think. In the Bryce and the Brechas HaKosim and daladamas, the pool from where they used to wash is 4 amos, v'ha anan tznan gimel tfachim. We said 3 tfachim. What do you mean 4 amos? Rav Nachman must be like Rav Nachman that indeed there's this distinction made between the different things. There's a question. Tznan the Mishnah is in Brechas HaKosim and gimel tfachim. It's 3 tfachim from the pool. Vatanya. The Bryce says 4 amos. Rav Nachman. It depends whether you're from the Machamson or whether you're from the Najan. It's either effectively 3 tefachim or 4 amos. And finally, he simply taught it explicitly in the Mishnah. The Mishnah was actually saying from the edge of this Machamson pool, and the wall is 3 tefachim, and that's how far away it needs to be. Specifically talking about the Machamson, the place where they used to soak them in. Rashi says it's the second end of the second line at the top. Machamson is nivreches shesherim b'yas begadim. The pool you soak the clothes in yomi amam deal tunu b'tzeres klovim in dog excrement achemachmitzin and masrich, and they get very bad and they go very bad as a result. But that presumably is supposed to clean them. Avnajin reches shekovsin meshafshvin ba. They soak it in and they rub them in that pool. Here, there's some water splashes a long distance, and therefore that's why you need to be 4 amos away. And then it said in the Mishnah, v'sod b'sid. So you've got to be that distance, and you've got to also sort of lime it with the pool with lime to prevent the water going out and causing damage. They ask the question: is it and line it with lime, or is it either or? Have you got a choice between doing the distancing and the lime, or do you have to do both? That's the shaila, right? That's the shaila, yeah. So the Gemora says, Pshita, it's obvious the v'sod b'sitnan, that it's and sod b'sit and you use line as well. The Mishnah says the Isa of the osod b'sitnan, because had it been the case that it was either or, with or without, so you got a choice. The imkain of solo vinav listeninu should list them together. It should put them together with the previous case where it clearly is either or. In the first part of the Mishnah, the later on in the Mishnah, it clearly says either or. Yeah. Therefore, if it was the same here, it would mix up the cases together. So therefore, it must be here. It is you have to do both. That's why they're different. That's not proof. The 2 types of damages are not comparable. Reisha hazeka demasunta, seifa hazeka dehavla. They're not comparable one to the other. The first one is a case of damage done by water, and the seifa hazeka dehavla. The end is damage done by heat, and that's why they're separate. It doesn't mean the rules are separate. The rules might be exactly the same. They might both be either distancing or using the lime. And they're listed separately simply because they're two different types of damage. I meant to say at the beginning of the shares we put on the group that the share tonight is Lilui Nishmas from his father, passed away the virus today, and that the share is Menachem Nochem ben Meir HaKohen. Should be a Lilui Nisham of him. This is so the question. So anyway, this is the Gemara's. Basically, what the Gemara is saying is the question remains. You can't prove it from the structure of the Mishnah as to whether or not in this scenario it's both or either or. You can't prove it. You want to try to prove it from the structure of the Mishnah itself. In other words, it tried to say, well, hold on a second. There are two cases. If there are two cases, must be that one is that there are different rules in each case. One is both distancing and lime, and the other one is, you got a choice. So well, no, they're exactly the same. You could say they're exactly the same rules. And the only reason they're listed in separate cases is because they are different cases. One is water damage, one is damage by heat, right? That's why they're separate cases.
But he uses different language in each case.
It doesn't, well, what with the lime?
No. Yeah. It's one in the first case, it's the salt based.
Yeah.
In the second case, it's not clear, right? In the Mishnah. And in brackets,
well, hold on a second. Well, the doubt we have is on the first case. So the first case we have it, the way we have it in the Mishnah is and. But that's the doubt. We're not sure. The Gemara is not sure whether it's and or. The Gemara is taking on that it is clear that the latter cases is definitely, the second case is definitely either or. Yeah, it's definitely either or. Yeah, that's what the Gemara. You know how the Gemara knows that. You know, why is it obvious in one case and not the other? It's not entirely clear. It's not entirely clear. You see, and the Mishnah, interestingly enough, in the second case, the way it's read in our Gemara is in our text of the Mishnah is or, but actually the Masoras Hashas changes the text to say there's another nusach which is v and. See, the text of or would be better. Would be better with our Gemara. Tosfos there talks about it, I can see on the Mishnah. Yeah, the second last Tosfos on Yud Zayin Amdalaf talks about it. He says, you can see it quickly. It's the second last Tosfos Yud Zayin Amdalaf on the Mishnah. Nira Lerid B'Seifa Nami Goras V'Sod B'Sid. He says it has to be that both cases are and V'Lo Goras Oy and not or. The Yigas in B'Seifa Oy Sod B'Sid had it said at the end or. Okay, and if so, Tifshu D'Bereisha V'Sod B'Sid Tnan. The first case must be and. Otherwise it would say or in the first case, the same as the last case. He's not proving it from the fact that they're listed in two separate cases. The Gemara deals with that. He's saying if it was the case that the second case said or and the first case said and, then obviously you'd say, well, that's specific because that's why it's using different language, which was your point, obviously, right? They're different language, yeah. It must be and in both cases. This is my question. Why is it, and the fact that it was obvious in the Gemara to be safe of the Osod said that in the end case it was or it's not such a big damage. The damage is not so significant that one or the other shouldn't be enough. So this is very clever. Tosfos there has answered every question we had, basically, and essentially said that the Gemara was obvious to the Gemara that the latter case, which is damage through heat, you know, the zevel and the salt and all that type of stuff, was obviously either or, because the heat damage of these items is less significant than the potential water damage, which by the way makes a lot of, just logically makes a lot of sense. Meaning, what heat are we talking about here? We're not talking about a furnace. We're talking about, like these things are heat producing, like the olive refuse and the salt and lime. They're not giving off a major source of heat. Whereas the water damage, which was the first case, is much more of a, anyway, so either way, the Gemara can't prove it from the Mishnah itself. So the Gemara says, let's prove it from here. Toshma, let's prove it from here. Rabbi Yehuda over it says, Sela above your daim. a rock which comes away in your hand, rock which is this earth which comes away by itself, a rock which comes away, rocks which come away in your hand. This one digs his pit on this side, and this one digs his pit on that side. This one distances 3 tefachim and uses lime. The other one does the same. The implication is they have to do both because it comes away in the hand. If it didn't come away in the hand, you don't need to. You wouldn't need to. That's the implication. So the Gemora says, look, who adin because the Gemora is inferring here from the fact that this is a very significant, this is a clear and present danger of damage, yeah, because the loose earth is presumably we're worried about the damage caused by the digging itself, and that there it says clearly you've got to do both. If it's not loose earth, you don't need to. So who I didn't know, you can really say that even if you can say that even if it doesn't come away in your hand, you also have to use lime. So you have to do both. And it has to tell me about coming away in the hand. So I might think, even the Bobi Odayim, since it comes away in your hand, the boy Rav Chutzvei, you might need even more space than 6 tefachim, than 3 each. Komash Malon, it comes to tell you that you don't need to. So in other words, what I'm saying, try to prove from that case, Rabbi Yehuda, from the fact that it's a case of loose rock, and there he says specifically you have to do both. That implies if it wasn't loose, you'd have a choice. You have to do both. Well, no, it's not proof. The reason why he talks about that case is because in that case you might think you have to be even further than 3 tefachim, right? Because the earth is so loose, and therefore he tells you that you don't have to. No, he tells you don't have to. So we leave it unresolved. But there is a Shittim Makabet says something about this in a second. Let's see Rashi. Rashi is, where is Rashi? It's on the second narrow line. Either distancing or liming. So we suggested originally you should mix up the two cases, the Hossam, the first case and the middle case, the Hossam Osab B'Sitnan. The second case is definitely or the middle case. Elamidoloi Arvinu. From the fact that it doesn't mix them up, you see the Bereisha of Osab B'Sitnan. The first case is and. We need both Harchok B'Sit, both distancing and line. Yeah. That's the implication from the fact it doesn't mix them up. First case is and. Yeah, right. So
the question is, the Gemora is coming to talk about a case where you have weak soil conditions, right? So we are now learning that actually it's got nothing to do with the soil.
Yeah, that was the suggestion. Suggested answer was, is the next. That's one more Rashi. Had talked about we this is what we suggest that in the weak soil condition implies that's why you need to have both. But if it wasn't weak, you wouldn't. You'd have a choice. You can either distance or lime it. Yeah. So we say no. I had to talk about Bobi Odayim, weak soil. Even the same applies even if it's not weak soil. Why does it talk to me about why does Rabbi Yehuda choose a case of weak soil? Because with weak soil, you might think you've got to go even further, because the damage is much more. So
you learn from that if literally the land was made up of rock, you still need to have 3 tefachim.
That's the implication. Although we did see in certain cases that if there's, remember we saw in the previous stuff, that if there's what they call a tsunmo, there's like a bedrock. Right. Remember that, that kind of interrupts between the two properties. So we used that. We didn't use that. We didn't say that here. We used that about the tree roots. You remember about the tree roots where, we said, where there's the guy, there's, how can you put it so near? Well, the answer is because there was bedrock. There was what we call a tsunmo. There's a difference in the language between a tsunmo and a cellar. The cellar just seems to be regular stones, I think. A tsunmo is like I think it means there. It seems to refer to like a bedrock of some sort. Anyway, we leave the question unresolved. So the question is, do you need both or not? It's quite an important point. The Shittim Makubet says here, one second. He says like this, he quotes the Rashba. In Psak Halacha, when it comes to the halachic psak, since we started off by saying it's obvious that you have to have, that it means both, okay? Hochin kaimalon. That's what we hold by. The Avagav the Dochinon, even though we pushed it away and we said Dilma Mishum to the Domi Hayazeka Hayazeka. The only reason we said you can't prove it from the fact that the more sort of started by trying to prove it from the language of the Mishnah. So we said, right, from the fact that it says in the Mishnah from the fact that it splits the cases in the Mishnah into two cases, and we know that the latter case is that you definitely require you definitely either or is enough in the next case. That was the suggestion originally. Yeah, the second case in the Mishnah is clearly either or. So from the fact that the second case in the Mishnah is either or implies the first case is both. That's what we said. Now we pushed that away and we said no, that's not a proof. That's not a proof. You know why I listed two cases? Just because they're two different types of damages. One is fire, and one is heat, and one is water. Right? So the Rashba says, even though we pushed it away, very, very interesting idea. He says, this is not just relevant to here, this is relevant to many other Gemaras potentially. He says that when the Gemara has a track that it assumes is correct, a default position. Let's suggest we assume that the Mishnah lists it in two cases, two separate cases, therefore, logically, right, case A it has different rules to case B. We know that case B, you have a choice of either distancing or liming your pit. Or you like whatever it is, liming the thing, you got a distance, right? Therefore, logically, the first case must be you have to do both. That was the Gemara's initial analysis. The Gemara said it's no proof. That's called a dichui. Push it away. Who says? Maybe it's just two cases because they're two different types of damage. So the Rashba says, where we are unsure and the Gemara leaves it unresolved, we don't say la halacha. You've got to do one or the other. You've got to make a decision here, right? Are you going to say you need both or one or the other? So the logical place to go is how the Gemara assumed it was. The fact that it said it's not a concrete proof, because you could say that the Mishnah lists it simply in two cases because they're different types of damages. All right, that was a dichui. It was a way of pushing aside the logical assumption. But since we it's left unresolved in the Gemara, exactly. Go with the default position. Go with the logical assumption at the beginning. That's right. Which means you would require both in cases of water damage. So next time you're digging a pit in your property, make sure you distance it and also lime it with plastic or something like that, something suitable. Yeah. There we are. Okay. So the next case in the Mishnah was but if you distance these things like all these things that heat producing, right? The refuse. There's a name for it. I saw the name earlier today. Anyway, there's a name for it. But it means olives, the refuse of olives. Pardon? It says they're exothermic. Does it say that? No. Oh, it doesn't say that. Right. No. I meant there's a name for these decomposing olive stuff that gives off heat. Vesa zevel and that's dung, vesa melech and salt, vesa sloim, sid lime, vesa sloim and rocks as well, etc. Yeah. By the way, there's a bit of a problem, that it lists lime. Because how can you lime? One of the ones.
Sid was clay.
Is it? I thought it was. I think lime.
It says the on Sid when they had the stones.
Yes, it does say that.
They didn't cover them in lime. They covered them in clay.
I think they covered them in lime. Did they cover them with clay? Does it mean clay there?
Because lime is acidic.
You can't write on lime.
I mean, no. Sorry, the other one.
You can't write on it. Doesn't it harden? Limestone doesn't it become like? I don't know.
I was thought Sid was clay.
Don't know. But I don't know. I don't even know what the answer is. But I don't understand exactly how you lime. Because one of them is lime. So it's a bit. Anyway, yeah. Don't know. Doesn't talk about that. Anyway, this is the whole list. There must be a simple answer to it, I imagine. But the Gemara says like this. Tanan also. So this is Mishnah in Shabbos. Now the Mishnah, the where this is relevant, this list, you find in a totally different area of halacha, and that is the halachos of Hatmona. when you're wrapping something, you're not allowed to wrap something before Shabbos, which is heat producing. Yeah, if you wrap something before Shabbos in something that is mosif hevel, that adds heat, that's also. It's a gezerah drabanan, even if you do it on Friday afternoon, completely wrap something, because of the fact that you might come to do it with coals and stoke the coals. That's the classic reason why, if you have one of those blankets, that can be potentially quite dangerous anyway, but the blankets that go on top of the blech that keeps the food warm, those things?
I don't use them.
No, but you've seen them, right? They're like you've never seen this? It's like a heat resistant. Yeah, it's like a big challah. It's like a heat resistant thing. But basically, you put on top of the food. You have your blech, and then you have the food, and it goes on top of the food, and it keeps it warm. Now, if you completely wrap the food and the blech, right, with one of these things before Shabbos, you're not allowed to do that before Shabbos. You have to leave it open on the sides. Because that's called Hatmona b'davar mosif hevel. It's a gezerah drabona. It's Gemora in Shabbos. Perek b'metom. It's whole perek. Yeah, you're not allowed to wrap things because in something before Shabbos, something which adds heat, because that is you might come to stoke coals and things, right? Now on Shabbos, you can't even wrap. You can't wrap even on something which is not mosif hevel. You can't completely wrap something on Shabbos to preserve its heat, right? Even if it doesn't add any heat, even if what you're doing doesn't add heat. The first case, the case of the chaladekel thing on the blech, that's called wrapping b'davar hamosif hevel, adds heat. Why? Because even though the wrapping doesn't have a heat source, because it's in wrapping and enhancing the heat source that's underneath. Yes, therefore it's a problem, right? Therefore, it's a problem, right? Because it's enhancing that heat from a heat source. That's called hatmona b'davar mosif hevel. Even if it doesn't go, I think, completely under the heat source, but it's covering the thing on top completely, right? That's awesome.
Add it before Shabbos?
Can't add it before Shabbos. You can use the cloth, you just have to leave the sides open a bit. That's how it works, right? They're designed to be used that way. It's actually dangerous, I think, anyway, to cover it. You can set fire to something. It's not a good idea to do that anyway, right? You don't want this cover to be touching the blech, right? Because it's not, not safe. Now, so on Shabbos as well, if you have, let's say, a something, let's say a pot, you're taking it off the blech, whatever, you use it, you want to keep the food in it hot after you've finished serving it. Let's say you think someone might turn up for a bit more chicken soup half an hour later. So what you're not allowed to do even on Shabbos is wrap it completely to keep the heat inside. That's halacha. That's called hatmona b'davar she'eina mosif hevel, which doesn't add heat. Completely in wrapping something even doesn't add heat is also even on Shabbos. There are not that many circumstances where you might come to do that, right? And there's quite a few criteria, to that need to be fulfilled for it to be also. So a classic example is, are you allowed to use a thermos flask on Shabbos? Because you could argue that's hatmona b'davar she'eina mosif hevel. Now, a thermos flask doesn't add heat; it preserves heat. That's what it does. Yes. Now, if you pour water from an urn into a thermos flask on Shabbos, you could argue that's hatmona b'davar she'eina mosif hevel. Hatmona means either wrapping the pot or the food. Here you're wrapping the food. Is it allowed? Yeah, it is. Don't worry. Why? Why is it allowed to do? Why are you allowed to fill a thermos flask on Shabbos? Why is it not? Yes, that's the answer. Because hatmona only applies to the hatmona, which is hatmona in something which is not mosif hevel, which doesn't add heat on Shabbos, has got a number of criteria for it to be also. It has to be completely enwrapped, and it has to be either wrapping the food directly, right, or the pot in which it was originally what's it called? Cooked. So you putting it inside a klisheni, which is what you're doing in the thermos, is not a problem of hatmona, even though you essentially are wrapping the food, but you've moved that food into a klisheni. Does that make sense? I think so. I believe that's the reason. Anyway, that's a little introduction to hatmona, and the Gemora here is only concerned with the items which actually add heat. Toras Mishnah says there, with what can you conceal and what can you not conceal, this wrapping. You can't conceal in something in the gefes. This is olive refuse, the dung, melach, salt, the lime, and sand, whether it's moist or whether it's dry. So basically, the Gemara is picking out the anomalies here. If we're talking about things that add heat, why is it over here declining slow? Why here do we talk about rocks? But look at Tony Chol. and doesn't take about sand. Why over there over there it talks about sand, doesn't talk about rocks. Why is there a difference in the list? The lists are very similar, but they have these minor discrepancies. Says people don't usually wrap pots in rocks because why? Because it damages them, I think. Yeah, I think it's because it damages them.
Well, it can't be,
Pardon?
because it can't be more damaging than dung and other stuff.
No, that's all right. Nothing wrong with that. You've got to be man of the earth. So that's what they were. Nothing wrong with that.
You can wrap stones up. That's why it would damage a pot.
I think that's the reason. 1 second.
So if I heated up stones before Shabbos and then wrapped the pots up with those stones, that's not allowed. That's Hatmona.
Well, stones are not in the list of Hatmona because people don't usually do that. That's why they're not in the list. They're not given as an example. It's true though. In theory, that's still a problem. Yeah, if you did that, it would be a heat-producing source, and it would be a problem even before Shabbos. If you would use hot stones and keep it hot like that. These things are also even before Shabbos. You with me?
Yeah.
Because these lists are considered to be heat-producing. They're self-heat generating.
There's a note here in article. It says the heat escapes through the gaps.
Oh, that's why. So it just doesn't work.
I can't see a toast one.
I think it's in this long one here. Yeah, let's carry on a bit. I think more might help us a bit more with it. Anyway, there's a review of answers. So people wrap with conceal heat pots in strings of wool and threads of wool and strips of purple wool. The Brisa says over there also in Shabbos, you're allowed to do Hatmona with in Gizei Tzemer, but Tzipei Tzemer. Tzipei Tzemer is after they've been combed wool over Lashon Shal Gomon and tongues of this dyed wool of a mochin, which are threads but worn out bits of material. Yeah, but you can't move them because they're muktzah. They're muktzah, set aside for garments, right? So they're muktzah, but you're allowed to do Hatmona in them. Why are you allowed to do Hatmona in them? Why are you allowed to do Hatmona in them? Because they don't add heat. Yes, you can put them in these things before Shabbos because they don't add heat. They're not Mosef Hevel. Now, people don't do Hatmona in these things, and yet they are still listed as examples of things you are allowed to wrap your pot in before Shabbos. Elom Rabbi says it can't be. In other words, it can't be with giving examples of things which based on the fact that people do or don't use them. Elom Rabbi says Yagidol of Reo. What we do is there's a pasuk in Eov, and what we do is we look at what's next to it. Tana, not what's next to it. Sorry, its friend tells about each other. Basically, each Mishnah fills in the gaps of the other one. So we use Bava Basra to fill in Shabbos and vice versa. Tana Hochas Sloim Hud in Echol. Here it talks about rocks, and there it talks and sand. Also, Tana Hosam Chol Hud in the Sloim. There it talks about sand, and the same halacha would apply to rocks. So it's not a problem. Abaya's answer is very straightforward. Abaya's answer is that we just you just look at them together, and that's why some are listed here and some are listed there, and it's not so surprising. Omale Rava says, if you say you look at the contemporary case and you say, well, the other case is friend, and that tells you about the other one, it should list all of them in one group, in one of the two places, and one of them should be in the other place. Yes, and then we'd say, we should say it should tell about the other. Right? Pardon? Yeah, that's right. Well, there's a difference in the text. There's some Bach changes it a little bit. The other one of them in the other one, you should say that they each teach about each other. So, or the same with the other one. Over there, the reason why it doesn't talk about rocks is not because people don't usually use them. It's because this is what you were going on, Jeremy. Because they damage the pots. because they damage the pot. So beforehand, the Gemara was saying, the suggestion was just that people don't usually do so. Rava says that can't be the reason because there are all sorts of things listed there that people don't usually use, but they're just giving examples, right? So therefore, Rava says, no, it's because people don't do it because it would damage the pot. Here it doesn't talk about sand. We're looking for things that are heat producing. Sand is not heat producing. As sand preserves, it warms up things which are already warm, and it cools things which are already cool. It's a good insulator. And therefore, for our list, we don't want to list sand because it's not, in our case, right? In our case, we are talking about something which can produce heat in and of its own accord. Sand can't do that. The properties of sand are such, says the Gemara, that if you have something already hot that's enwrapped in sand, that will help it get hotter. I don't know the science of this, but I'm not a scientist. But that's what the Gemara is saying, yeah? So the sand can actually make it get warmer. Whereas it can't do here it's something which is neutral in our case. There's just a load of sand. It's not going to make any heat problems. So Tana Nami, Tana Rabbi Yosha did talk about sand. He talked in our Mishnah sand. Hosam Masuna. There it's talking about wet sand. Wet sand is a problem of liquid. It goes in that category. Tana Nami listening. Why don't we talk about wet sand according to our time? Why is our time on the list wet sand? But look at me with Masuna. Could talk about sand and say it's talking about moist sand. It talks about a channel of water. That's good enough. We don't need to give another water example. What do you mean there's two water examples? There's the channel of water and there's the pool, the washing pool. Those cases were both necessary. Had it talked about a pool of water or channel of water, I'd say because it's fixed in place. It means always there, in other words. But the pool of the washing pool, the lokfia, which is not always fixed. Sometimes you don't have it. You don't need to wash clothes or whatever. Aim or low. Therefore, you might think it's not a problem. And to talk about pool of water, because the water is static. Static water is more problematic whilst it's there. But a channel of flowing water is not such a big deal. You might think is not a problem, and therefore Tzricha needs to list both those cases. So, in other words, what we're saying is that sand is not listed in our Mishnah amongst the list of things that can produce damage by heat. Because sand can't do that. It's listed in Shabbos. That's because in Shabbos, it's a wrapping a hot pot. And when sand wraps a hot pot, then it produces heat, but not when it is by itself. So you'll tell me, why don't we list sand in our Mishnah and talk about wet sand, moist sand, like Rav Hoshia does? The answer is because wet sand is not necessary to include. We've given other wet examples. So why did you give several examples of moisture producing? Why didn't you just give one? The answer is the two that are listed in our Mishnah that produce liquid, which are Amas Hamayim, and there's the pit, but the pit's a bit different, I think, because that's also the digging aspect and things like that. The ones which specifically refer to water are the Amas Hamayim, the channel of water, and the washing pool. And those two, there's a specific reason why it has to list both, because they have different qualities. The Amas Hamayim is a problem because it's always there. Constant presence of water is more likely to eventually cause some damage. But on the other hand, it's flowing water, which for some reason seems less of a problem than static water. I suppose because when it's static, even if it's not always there, when it is there, it's going to cause more of a problem. So that's what the Gemara says. Yeah. Let's see the Rashi. Yeah, let's see Rashi. Rashi, where is Rashi? Yeah, about a quarter of the way down. What can you consider on the hot food on Shabbos? However, the Rabbanan said you're not allowed to conceal in something which adds heat. There, the reason is explained. It's a decree in case you come to conceal in coals. It's a Gezerah Rabbanan. You can't put Hatmana even before Shabbos comes in something which adds heat, because you might come to do it in coals. If you do it in coals, you stoke the coals, and that's also on Shabbos min Torah. Therefore, Chazal will go on these cases as well. The Shena Shalagon Shemetz died world Acha Chazve Chliku b'Masrei. They divided it, separated its script, they sort of combed it out with a comb. But also the Shena made into tongues. The Chidak and Hatmin Bahen. The rabbis still talk about them. Sipei Tzemel Achshav Sarkov and Neftu Masrei. Tzipei Tzemer is after you comb it with a comb of a moichin or I think nitzu really means to beat, but whatever. It's that type of thing. This is the kind of worn out piece of garment. The coma removes them from the garments of wool with thorns. They are set aside for the work of garments. That is why these things are muktzah. These things are muktzah. I mean, you can ask the obvious question here, right? If you're allowed to do hatzmona in these things before Shabbos, you are going to hide your pot inside these bits of material, but the material itself is muktzah. So how are you going to get your pot out? Your pot is completely wrapped in muktzah. So I think, if I'm not, we'll be learning this in the morning actually, Mr. I think it's to do with kind of you'll lift the pot out and then the things fall off, basically. I think this is discussed in Hilchos Muktzah, how you access it. Why is the pot not a bossis? But the halachas are bossis with muktzah, right? You got your pot, and on top of it, you've got muktzah, like bits of material. These bits of material are muktzah. So the pot should be a bossis, the davar ha'asa for the muktzah item. There's a lumdish answer. Why is it not a bossis, the davar ha'asa? Bossis is something where you intend. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's a little bit more. I mean, you're right. Yeah, you're right. But basically, if you want to sort of make it a bit more flowery, basically the way it was like this is that the concept of a bossis, as the name suggests, yes, is that it serves the muktzah item. If the muktzah item is serving the bossis, then it can't be a bossis, right? By definition. That's very interesting. Yeah, even if you intended it to be there and it's going to be there, when Shabbos came in and everything else, the muktzahs on top of it, got supporting it by the pot. Yeah, but it's there to its function is to support, is to serve the pot. So that's why it's not a bosses. I think if my memory serves me correct. Anyway, okay, so it's muktzah, but nevertheless you can do out one of them. If it's Yagadol of Reo, you say that we just have one and then it helps the other one. We should do them in one case. Listen, we say one in the other case. And then we should just say Yagadol Rei, one teaches about the other. All of them because of heat, and one of them either here or with Shabbos. So therefore, because of that, that we should say one in one case and then all the rest in the other, and then they should teach about each other. Because of that, Rava says like this. It's because Hanach Mishum. The mishtaki lo lekedera, shemishabenes lekedera, break the pot. Kach shamati kanav muchomok mishmati shemale chaluda. Rashi says here, I understood that mishtaki lo. I always learned it as Rashi says it was. I heard that the pshat is that it means that it damages the pot, but elsewhere I heard that it means that it creates rust. Yeah, it creates rust. That's the issue. Yeah. So in fact, Toras here refers to, interestingly, the minhag was in their times. Toras says minhag shalonu. They used to be matmin in these stones, in stones that fire came out from. That's what they used to do. I think he's talking maybe. That's maybe, I don't know whether he's talking about what they did during the week, or maybe there were reasons why it was allowed on Shabbos. But anyway, that's what they because really stones, it would things if they produce heat, of course you can't. Anyway, so Rashi carries on. Chaim, he puts something hot in there, it warms up. With Hatzmona, it warms it up. With the wall, it's cold. Rabbi in his Tosefta, he lists the distancing in our Mishnah, and he mentions V'ka'omar Chol Gabay, it says sand. Masuna Eitz Lezek Lichluach Shonai talks about damages of liquid, of moisture. B'choylach V'loitz Hezek Hevel talks about moist sand and not damages made by heat. V'ches Kos and Lukfiok Amasamayim. It's not fixed like a channel of water. Shamasamayim, a channel of water. Osulios Shamilomis Def Eva. V'zua Kovis. Sometimes the washing person chooses a different career. Not always, you might set up a pool for washing in your back garden. You might decide, actually, I don't really like this job. I'm going to do something else. The moisture is more damaging than flowing water, right? That's why potentially. That's why it has to list both cases, because one is steady and one is static, and one is flat. Obviously. Okay. So we're now 4 lines at the bottom of the Omid. Distance the seeds and the plow. This was the next case in the Mishnah. Distance the seeds and the plow away from the wool. One asked the obvious question: why do you need both? The seeds, yeah, you got to plow before you can sow. Generally, yeah, you got to plow and then you got to sow. So therefore, why is it that we have to talk about seeds? You can just talk about plowing, and that will cover you because you're going to have to distance for that reason anyway. You're never going to get onto the seed thing. So even if you don't sow, you still got a problem just by plowing. But Mapolis Yad, we're talking about types of seeds that don't require plowing. You dig a little spade, and you put the seeds in basically. The question the other way around as well. When you plow, why don't we just talk about the seeds, right? If you plow, you're going to sow. That's why you're going to sow. That's the whole point. And it talks about seeds. So why would you have a scenario where you're plowing and not sowing? You don't need both cases, right? Same question the other way around. The Gemora says as well, you can have a situation where you're plowing for the trees. They used to plow around the trees to improve the land or the soil for the tree. So that's another case. For the plowing alone, you're going to need to distance. Says the Gemara, you have to distance because of water. You can't sow seeds without watering them. So why do you have to talk about the issue of the seeds needing to be a certain distance away? Why do seeds have to be distanced? Because they grow, no? And they cause damage when they grow, isn't that right? I think so. Yeah, that's the issue. That's what we're assuming the issue is. So there's a problem with water. The water is going to be an issue. You're going to water your seeds, and that's going to cause a problem. The more just analyzing our Mishnah and saying you don't need all these cases, right? That you've got do one process, and the process is going to involve elements that are osa without you coming into listing all these other elements. And once it's Tana Beretz Yisrael Koi, the Tana is in Eretz Yisrael, the Chsiv, or the Pasuk says the Mitar Shamayim Tishta Moyim. You don't need to sow. You don't need to water because you rain. You water from heaven. The Meimra Ditzrayim Tzadin Komish Tarshi. Is the implication that the seeds actually grow roots to either side, and that's why they go under the wall and they damage the foundations? Is it not the case that they go straight down? Well, tonight the Mishnah says a mavrich esagefen ba'aretz. The Mishnah says if you are mavrich a vine, so mavrich is where you take one solitary branch. Yes, you bend it under the ground. Yeah, and you bring up another place and it creates another tree. What's that called? It's not grafting. What's the English for it? There's an English term, I think. Mavrich is not whatever it is, and you understand that's what it is. You bring the branch and then it goes up elsewhere. So the halacha is if there isn't earth on top of it 3 tefachim thick, lo yovi zera aleh. You're not allowed to bring seeds to sow on top of it. The Tani Allah, but it was taught that you're allowed to sow either side. So what are we worried about here? This mission is talking about kilayim, yeah? So you've got this vine, and the vine goes underground, and it's going to come up somewhere else. So you've got to have 3 tefachim of earth, right? Otherwise, you can't put seeds there where the vine is underground, because presumably we're assuming 3 tefachim is the roots of your seeds are not going to get to the vine, right? But if there was less ground than that, they will, and that's going to be a problem with kilayim, right? But you're allowed to sow either side, directly, either side of that vine. So if seeds grow roots in a diagonal direction or a horizontal as opposed to straight down, then it should be a problem with kilayim. And we're worried that's our problem in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is all very, you're sowing your seeds, and we're worried the roots are going to go underneath. I don't think seeds have very extensive roots. Depends what you're sowing, probably. But this is a problem. So it says, you're right. The roots go straight down. What is the problem with seeds? The problem is that they basically kind of damage, they weaken the ground. Machlidin literally means to rust. The Maseres Shas brings Rabbeinu Chananel, which explains it that it comes from the word weasel. because they draw the nourishment from the ground like a weasel which lives in houses and I suppose, I don't know, damages the house or whatever, right? So that's what the seeds are doing. They're drawing nourishment away from the ground, and they bring up soft earth next to the wall. So with time, what that does is that damages the foundations of the wall. It's an amazing thing. You can have tiny little things which over time, it's like Rabbi Kiva and the stone and the water, you know, but over time they can cause immense damage. So sowing these seeds within 3 tefachim of the wall is completely innocuous. My tiny little plants, they're not hurting you, but they will do with time. Yeah, that's how it is. That's how it is. Right. Let's see Rashi. No, yes, all right. That's right. That's right. And towards the end, about 10 lines from the bottom. You plowed it first, even if you don't sow. It talks about distancing. The Tana talks about distancing. Mapolas yad. But Mapolas, you got to distance anyway. Mapolas you sow it without plowing. You dig with the spade. You don't deepen it like the depth of the plow. Depth of the plow. So we should talk about Zoroim seeds. People who plow, at the end of the day, they're going to sow. Zoroim talks about seeds. There are trees there a long time before. You're plowing underneath them to improve them. To water them always, given the since it's impossible with serve seeds without water. Why do you have to teach them? Or why do you have to tell them in the Mishnah? It talks about damage of moisture next to the wall. So let's start in Komish Darshi. They weaken underneath the wall, and they damage the foundation of the wall. That's what we said. That's the problem. When Rashi top of the next one, a solitary vine, there's nothing wrong with. There's no mixture problem of kilayim with seeds next to it. A vineyard is never less than 5 vines. Chomesh kefanim. Shtaim can take it shtaim, 2 opposite 2. The achas yotzei zona, one coming out as a tail. That's the minimum size of a vineyard. And a shaloyona kazera min hagefen. The only problem is if the seed cannot nourish directly from the vine. Meaning, the reason why you can put your seed so close to this vine is because it's a solitary vine. Because there's halachas of a kerem. A kerem has rules as to how close you can get to in terms of the seeds and other things around it. But that only applies when it's a kerem, when it's a vineyard. The minimal size vineyard is 5 vines. You don't have 5 vines, you've got 1 vine. So you just got to make sure it doesn't directly sort of nourish from the thing. The word mavrich is like bending the camels, bend their legs, right? By Yavrech Hagamalim. This was the Eliezer by the well, right? Bend the camel. Kofeg zmeres gefen muchuberes. You bend the twigs of an attached vine. Mavrich of a karka. I bet the article gives a fancy translation, Jeremy, of mavrich. They're famous for good long words in the art scroll.
Mavrich is a karka.
Mavrich, it's a gefen. So I put it on the spot. I'll finish Rashi while you're finding. A mavricha b'karka, right? And you basically bend it into the ground. You bend the vine, gefen muchaberes, mavricha b'karka. You bend it into the ground, bitzideh on the sides of the canal either direction. The current belaz pruvnier, right? He gives the old French word, which is pruvnier. Anyway, it doesn't tell you what. Well, he must translate it in some way.
Well, mavrich is a gefen.
How do they translate that? Huh?
Ben.
Ben. Okay. All right. I thought it'd be a fancy translation. Okay. Anyway, so what is it kind of like draws away the nourishment from the ground next to the wall in that place. In that place, when Malin brings up soft earth, and it weakens the ground that's under the foundation of the wall on either side. That is the problem. The problem is that you weaken the ground with time, and that's why you've got to be very careful where you put the seeds. You put the seeds. Yeah. 2 seconds.
What seeds is what we're talking about? We're talking about. I mean, seeds is generic for any plant, any
Seeds? Yes. Well, we know we're not talking about trees. We're talking about seeds. Seeds. We're talking about seeds. And no, Zroim is like no, it doesn't mean trees. It doesn't mean seeds that grow into trees. It means seeds like wheat seeds and things like that, I think. Yeah, I think so. Second. Somewhere here. No, I've got written inside of my Gemora from a time I've learned this in the past, that the Yad Ramah says that based on this, the conclusion of the Gemora here, that's why Rabbi Yossi will agree, even Rabbi Yossi agrees, you're chayav for the Zroim. Because it's direct, it's called Geri delay. It's like your arrow is causing direct damage. So interesting that. There's a problem. You understand the question? I mean, I'd have to look up the site, but the question here is obvious, right? There's no machlokes in our Mishnah about Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim, right? We learn Rabbi Yossi, right? Rabbi Yossi says it's alanizik lahachasatzme, the one who's being damaged has to himself, right? Remember that? Where the Rabbanah halamazik lahachasatzme. And there's a whole machlokes later on, as we've seen many number of Mishnayos where they have this debate, right? Like when you plant your tree and the roots are going to take time to get there. Rabbi Yossi says, you're tough luck. You move yourself out of the way. I can plant my tree. Yeah, alanizik. So why here in our Mishnah does Rabbi Yossi agree? Now, most of the Mishnah, that's not a question, right? We talked about it in the Gemora. We said, when you dig the hole, when you dig the pit, what happens? The earth, you damage the earth, right? You shake the earth, yeah? We talked about the water. The water is also going to be a straight damage. That's also going to be Geri delay, because Rabbi Yossi agrees that it's your direct damage, like shooting an arrow. And same with all the fire, all these things are direct. So he says that's why the seeds are also direct. Because, you understand? Because if the damage is being caused not by the roots growing into the thing, but the fact that as soon as they're planted, they start weakening the earth, you can understand why it's Geri delay. So that's quite interesting. I'm going to do a few more lines because it's very straightforward and it's going to go a few more minutes. This is going to tell you all about how you're not allowed to pass water next to someone's wall because it can damage the wall. You got to distance urine from a wall 3 tefachim. That's one of the things we said in the Mishnah. Rabbi Birnbaum says you're allowed to pass water beside the wall of one's friend. And he says, I'll bring you a posuk in Malachim. The posuk is I'll cut off from Achov Mashtin Bakir, those who urinate against the wall. That is a derogatory term to refer to men. In other words, it's basically used in the Novi as a like a scornful way. Achov was a wicked king, yeah, and the punishment that's given to him is he wouldn't have male descendants. Why do male descendants referred to as Mashtin Bakir? Because it's like not a very respectful way to talk about men. Atzur v'azuv b'Yisrael, I think means kind of like forsaken. Well, azuv is forsaken. Atzur is I can't remember what's atzur. What?
Cut off. No?
Atzur is cut off. Is it?
Also, they say it's the wealth stored in the houses.
The wealth stored in the houses. Okay. That's what he's going to lose, right? Atzur v'azuv b'Yisrael is also going to lose all things.
It's the livestock left out.
Okay, fine. So it refers to other things he's going to lose. Wealth that's stored up and also livestock. Right. So therefore you see the fact that it's called that, although it's derogatory, you see that it's the normal way for people to behave, right? Mashtin Bakir. Therefore, it must be allowed to do so beside one's friend's wall. Says the Mishnah, if distance meraglaim urine from a wall 3 tefachim, hosen b'shofchin. It's talking about shofchin, pouring out a chamber pot. That's what you're not allowed to do near your friend's wall. But actually, just being mashtin is okay. That's what we're suggesting. The next bit, the Bach leaves out, so skip the next few the brackets. Toshma, let's prove from here. This is a Tosefta, lo yashtin odo mayim. A person is not allowed to pass water next to his friend's wall. Unless he distances unless he distances three tefachim, that is a kosel of bricks, a wall of bricks, a kosel of a wall of stones, because they yazik, as long as it doesn't cause damage. Tefach, one tefach, if it's made of stone, well, I think it's got to be, as it's only one tefach, it's less, basically it's less of a problem. If it's very, very close to the wall, less than a tefach away, then it's going to weaken the acidity, presumably, is going to cause a problem by the foundation of the wall. Mishel tsunma, but if it's a tsunma, which we said was like it's built into the bedrock, so then there's no problem. Mutza, then it's allowed. Tiyufta the Rabbi Bar Chana tiyufta. This is a complete refutation of Rabbi Bar Chana. Rabbi Chana says you're allowed to. This price says you're not allowed to. For Rabbi Chana Kroka Omar, Rabbi Chana brought posuk. He brought posuk in Malachim to support it. Hosamochi Omar. This is what it's saying there. It's not talking about people at all. I feel even some things that normally do urinate against the wall. I will not leave those for Achov. My new, and what is that? Kalba, dogs. So the posuk isn't referring to men. It's not referring to people. It's referring to dogs. And it's saying Achov is not allowed. Dogs certainly do this. And its dogs are not allowed. So basically it's Osa. That's what we're saying. It's not allowed to do so. Depending on the type of wall, unless there's a type of wall built into the bedrock where there's no concern at all. Otherwise, you do have to be concerned that it's weakening your friend's wall. You have this posuk in Malachim, which seems to refer to people doing so. No, it's referring to dogs. That's the Gemora. Let's see Rashi. Almost, so we see Derech Bnei Adam Kain. It's how people do. It's what people do. The Gemara answered b'shofchin ovid mole full chamber pot shofchin pours out the liyashin lekelok mashtin mamish liyashin clearly means urinating itself because the venom shem shel tit made of kind of like clay or whatever shnisyavshu b'chama is dried in the sun v'hem nimukim machmas hamayim they dissolve because of through the water. The kama, that's the problem. The kama tefach, we said if it is a wall of stones you can get closer. It just has to be a tefach away. Neshim atashdesh es hakarka. Matashdesh means it. Well, I think it dissolves the ground. Somach liyasoda coastal next to the foundation of the wall. But sunma, but if it's a rock, in coastal boni basala, it's built into the rock. The leikol and meichash, there's no concern. Tishtush hakarka for the dissolving of the land. Mutter, it's allowed. Somach mamish, right close by. Vasifa koi bekosel avonim, and it's going on the end of the case just before it, which means it's a wall of stones. So basically, the Bryce is saying if you have a wall of stone that is built directly into the bedrock, because it's a wall of stone, we're not worried about the wall. The only concern about being a tefach away was because of the point where it meets the ground, where you're going to weaken the foundation of the wall. If the wall itself is built into the bedrock, then there's no concern, and otherwise there is. There you are. So I hope you didn't mind us getting a little bit faster. We're covering a bit of ground. The next piece is a piece on Tuna Tara, and shortly actually in Daf Chof Aleph we get to the main sugya of chinuch, main sugya in the whole Gemara, whole Shas about chinuch. What fascinating stuff coming up. So Mitzvah Hashem, we will share on Chanukah next week. We will continue. That's it, I think. Okay. Have a good evening.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, pleasure. Bye.